So in episode 1, we were introduced to essentially the villain in a way. So Jerry Krause was made into the villain very quickly. We saw how he wanted to rebuild following the 98 season, get rid of Phil, Jordan, all that. He wanted to rebuild because he wanted credit. And so that's where it kind of led you in episode 1. That's the idea that they wanted to get out of it. And Reinsdorf, the owner of the team, even said that they could go 82-0 and Phil would be gone. And so it's clear where their mindset was, where they wanted to head at that point. And then the large majority of the rest of the episode focused on Jordan's upbringing and his arrival into the NBA. And so we saw UNC, we saw his childhood, his parenting, which was great and was a big reason why he was the way he was. His mentality, his success and all that, his ability to handle pressure. And so we saw him at UNC with Dean Smith. And the big moment at UNC was the game-winning shot his freshman year in the national championship game against Georgetown, and how that gave him the confidence. How he said it changed his name from Mike to Michael, right? And that's the confidence that he got. And then you also had it covered how Bob Knight, who was the coach, obviously, he was at that time he was coaching for Team USA, which Jordan was part of as a college player, and he said that Jordan was the best basketball player he'd ever seen, and this is before he'd ever played a game in the NBA. And so you could see that ability in him. Guys like Bob Knight could. And so it was evident that he had what it took. Then I went to episode 2, which focused more around Scottie, and we saw the contract dispute that he had, how he was underpaid, 7 years, $18 million. That's obviously underpaid for Scottie Pippen, but me personally, at the time, that's what it was. He just signed his contract right before the NBA exploded in popularity, like really exploded in terms of monetary value, revenue, and all that. And so it ended up being a very cheap contract. But he did sign it. He was warned by Jerry Reinsdorf to not sign it, because if he did, Reinsdorf would not let him come back and try to renegotiate. And so if he signed it, it was over. But he did sign it, and we saw why. In his upbringing and all that, he grew up in real poverty, and so he had to take the money to give it for his family and all that. He had a rough upbringing, and so the money was financial security, immediate financial security, as opposed to waiting and possibly risking injury or something like that, and then not having any financial security. And so he signed it. And then you go to the 97-98 season, like if it goes back to it, because it jumps around time a lot, the show. And that happens throughout, which was a very interesting part of it. And so we go to the 97-98 season, and Scottie was coming off of a foot injury, and he decided he didn't want to get surgery and rehab over the summer, because he wanted to enjoy his summer. And instead, he decided to get surgery at the beginning of the season and rehab during the season. And so he missed a large part of the season. This caused a lot of turmoil between Scottie and the front office. And Scottie obviously did not like the front office. Jordan called Scottie selfish for this. Obviously, looking back at it, he said that when he was being interviewed for the show. And so it was selfish. I don't think Scottie Pippen looked very good in the show. Definitely not in this episode. But yeah, it was his decision. And then we go. The show takes you back to the pre-Scottie Bulls to see what it was like before Scottie got there, and it kind of puts Scottie's impact into context. Because before he was there, Jordan was still arguably the best player in the league. He was definitely one of the best players in the league. He just didn't have the accolades, but he did have the playoff series against the Celtics where he scored 63, and Larry Bird called him God disguised as Michael Jordan, and all of that stuff. So that was the idea of showing the pre-Scottie Bulls in the Scottie Pippen episode, because then we see that Pippen shows up and they start having more success because all of the load wasn't on Jordan anymore, so the defense couldn't just send 3 guys on him, especially because the Bulls weren't a very good team at that time. Obviously, Jordan was drafted to a poverty franchise, essentially, a team that had no history, no success in the past. It wasn't a good team, and so that's where it was for him. And then Pippen came, they got better, and we see how Pippen also doesn't like Jerry Krause at all, which was a recurring theme. Most of the players didn't like Jerry Krause because of his ego, the way he acted. He wanted credit for the organization, and he said, he had a quote, I'm paraphrasing, it was along the lines of, this is the best organization in the league. It's a great team, but it's the greatest organization. That's the reason we're winning. And so a lot of the players didn't like Jerry Krause, and Pippen, one of the main ones. And so from this episode, I really took away that Pippen just doesn't look great in the episode, because he was just selfish. He was in the whole 97-98 situation. In terms of the underpaid, it's not his fault. I don't blame him for taking the money because he needed the money, but he also knew that he wasn't going to be able to renegotiate. And so, was he underpaid? Yes, but it is what it is. Then episode 3 was the Rodman episode, which was interesting. Obviously, his backstory, how he was kicked out of his home at 18 and was essentially like homeless until 20, and he didn't have much to do, and so he just picked up basketball and he just started playing, and he got a spot on a college team, and he just made the most of it. He was a physical guy. He was a grinder, and so that helped him develop, and it led him to getting drafted, entering the NBA. He was a member of the Pistons, obviously. Those teams against Jordan that beat him up, he was part of that, so that was interesting. And obviously Rodman would have to develop a relationship with Jordan after getting to the Bulls, though I'm sure Jordan appreciated Rodman based on their battles against each other when Rodman was on the Pistons, because of how physical, and I'm sure Jordan appreciated the competitiveness. And we also saw the series against the Cavs with Doug Collins as the coach, and the main focus of that series in this episode was the game winner, the Jordan game winner on Elo. How he was surprised that Elo was guarding him because he knew he wouldn't be able to guard him, and so he just rose up and shot it, and Elo was visibly, like, you could see he couldn't believe it, what just happened, and yeah, that's what happened. And I thought, watching this episode, I could see why Rodman was the way he was later on, how he developed into what he became, through the anger that he had bottled up inside of him over the years, from being kicked out of his home and being homeless and all that, and he just had to grind, and it was difficult, and so he just acted out essentially. And then in episode 4 was the Phil Jackson episode, and also the big Bulls Piston episode really showed the struggle against the Pistons and how Jordan was struggling against them. They were beating him up, and how integral Phil was in getting them over that hump. And then also, obviously, the handshake controversy after the Bulls do beat the Pistons finally. And Isaiah Thomas just also doesn't look very good in this. The Bulls don't like Isaiah. Jordan especially hates Isaiah. And so he just doesn't look great in this episode. The Pistons don't. And you also gain a lot of respect for Jordan for how competitive he was in being dedicated to beating the Pistons. How his whole existence was dedicated to defeating them finally. And then he did. He did it, which says a lot about him. And Phil as well, who came in with the triangle and helped, and the implementation of that helped them get past the Pistons. And also, if you pay attention, the triangle was supposed to actually, like, the idea was that one player wouldn't, or well, the result of it would be that one player wouldn't really be able to, dominate as much. It would be more of a team game. But Jordan was so great that he still was able to lead the league in scoring and all of that stuff, or have high scoring numbers, 30 plus points per game, which is very impressive in that system. And then episode 5, which is the last episode I'm gonna cover in this podcast episode. It was the Dream Team episode, a large part of it, and how Isaiah was omitted from the team, and for obviously Stockton, which was interesting. And you could argue, as a player, he deserved the spot, but he dug his own grave in this case. Most players didn't really like him in the NBA because of how he and the Pistons, the bad boy Pistons, were. And so it's really his fault, to be completely honest, in my opinion at least. And then we also saw their series against Croatia and Kukoc, and how the Jordan and Pippen wanted to beat Kukoc so bad because Jerry Krause loved Kukoc, and so they were like, we're gonna show Jerry Krause that he doesn't know what he's talking about here. And they did the first time they played against each other, but then the second time Kukoc actually played pretty well and gained their respect in a way, in a sense, somewhat, I guess. And then we also saw Kobe with Michael and their relationship, and especially in the 98 All-Star game, how Kobe was a first-time All-Star, but he wasn't even a starter at that point. And still, all the other All-Stars, Jordan, all the other guys that were established, they had so much respect for him as a player, a competitor. And they were talking about him in the locker room, the little Laker boy, right? And then Kobe even said that he wouldn't have gotten 5 rings without MJ and his advice and all that. So that shows the relationship they had and what they meant to each other, which I thought was very interesting. And that's going to conclude this episode of the podcast, covering the first 5 episodes of The Last Dance. Please listen next time, episode 4 of the podcast, to hear the rest of the breakdown and my thoughts on it. And so, yeah, thank you for listening, or for watching, if you're watching the video version of it as well. And I'll see you next time.